You were never supposed to hear this. And yet, here you are, listening to a story pulled from the dirt. A story that was supposed to stay buried with the bones. Imagine a man whose hands never stopped digging, not for work, not for duty, but for hunger. An obsession that no law, no church, no coffin could restrain. Before start this story, please like and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon. The villagers thought he was just another gravedigger, bent and silent, the kind of man no one dared to notice. But what he unearthed was not for burial. It was for harvest. Flesh, bone, secrets older than the cemetery itself. They say his shovel rang not just against wood, but against history, against the hidden vessels of forbidden power. The soil beneath his boots was not simply earth, it was a vault, and what he unearthed, night after night, was not merely the dead, but something darker, something that should never have touched daylight again. The first whispers of his deeds spread when children in the village began seeing him after dark, carrying sacks that seemed too heavy, too misshapen to be firewood. They said his lantern glowed green, like swamp light, and the dogs would howl when he passed, tails tucked, teeth bared, not at a man, but at a thing wearing a man's shape. At first no one dared confront him. Who would? He handled the bodies no one wanted to touch. He dug the graves for the forgotten, the criminals, the plague-ridden. He was invisible, until the night someone followed him. What they saw has survived only in fragments of letters and court transcripts, buried deep in dusty archives. A barn door opened to reveal not sacks of potatoes, but limbs, stacked like firewood, stitched with cord, cleaned, numbered. Skulls lined up like trophies, jawbones labeled in Latin, and worse still, the faint pulse of something moving that should have been still. The villagers would later call it the harvest. But it wasn't crops. It wasn't food. It was flesh, stolen and reshaped, as if the gravedigger believed he could reap from death a second life. And here's the part that chills the blood. He was not the first. His work fit into a pattern stretching back centuries, a quiet brotherhood of bone keepers, each sworn to keep their craft hidden. But this one was careless. Or maybe, just maybe, he wanted to be caught. They say the gravedigger's true name was Elias Rood, but in the old court records it was scratched out, replaced with a single word: carrion. He had lived on the margins, an orphan raised among headstones, sleeping in crypts when storms tore through the countryside. Death was his mother, and the soil his only inheritance. Villagers said he carried a smell of damp rot, no matter how far he walked from the graveyard, as if the earth clung to him, refusing to let him go. Some whispered he had eaten the dirt of graves as a boy, that had hardened his stomach and blackened his teeth. When plague swept through the village, Elias did not weep as families died. He sharpened his tools. He dug faster, deeper, but not all coffins stayed closed. Strange cuts were later found on corpses after burial, bone saw marks, careful, surgical. A woman who lost her child swore she saw Elias days later holding something small and wrapped in cloth, rocking it as if soothing a baby that should have been hers. Was it grief that drove him? Or something older, a hunger passed down from shadows older than the church walls? The more bodies that fed the ground, the fuller Elias became. But fullness did not satisfy him. It grew into compulsion. Some villagers began to wonder if the plague itself had been drawn to them, called by the man who profited most from the dead. When winter fell and the ground froze, he still dug, still harvested, using fire to soften the soil. One night, the snow around his shack glowed faintly, as if lit from beneath by the bones themselves. When authorities finally began to suspect Elias, it was not because of the missing dead, but because of the living who began to vanish. A farmer's wife who went to tend her husband's grave was never seen again. A traveling priest stopped at the churchyard to pray and left his belongings behind, but not his body. Children who dared each other to sneak close to Elias's shack came back pale and wordless, refusing to speak of what they saw, until one boy whispered that Elias was not alone inside. He claimed to have seen figures moving in the candlelight, half-clothed in burial linens, their eyes dull but their limbs jerking as though pulled by strings. The sheriff raided Elias's dwelling one storm-heavy night, breaking through a warped wooden door that resisted like a coffin lid. Inside, the air was so thick with chemicals and rot that men gagged before their eyes adjusted. What they saw was described only once in a surviving report, and the words themselves read like a curse. Parts catalogued as books, heads stacked like coins, frames stitched and yet twitching. One deputy swore he heard something breathe, though no lips moved. In the corner, Elias sat cross-legged on a mound of skulls, calmly sharpening his shovel. He said one thing before they dragged him into chains: "The ground does not keep what it is owed. I only collect what belongs to me." Those who heard him repeat it later admitted the phrase echoed in their dreams, like a scripture, like a command they could not forget. Elias's capture should have ended the nightmare, but in truth, it only deepened it. When the jailers locked him in a stone cell beneath the courthouse, they reported that the smell of rot spread through the halls, though no body had been brought in with him. Guards swore they saw damp soil crumble from his clothes, as if the grave itself was still clinging to him. During his first night in custody, every lantern flame in the building guttered at once, and a sound like muffled digging echoed from beneath the floors. In the morning, the sheriff found the cell walls smeared with markings drawn in blood and soot, symbols not from scripture, but from something far older, curves and intersecting lines that seemed to writhe when stared at too long. Elias spoke little, but when questioned he whispered fragments. Roots beneath roots. Marrow holds the map. Bones remember what the living forget. The court tried him swiftly, branding him a madman, but villagers who crowded the trial claimed that as he passed, shackled and thin, every dog in the square began howling in unison. His eyes, they said, did not move like a man's eyes. They tracked in opposite directions, as if he were watching the living and the dead at once. The judge ordered his execution by hanging, but Elias laughed when the sentence was read. "Hang me in the air if you wish," he said, "but I belong to the ground, and the ground will not give me back." Those words, like a curse, sank into the marrow of the town. The execution of Elias Rood became the most crowded spectacle the village had ever seen, but it was not celebration that drew them. It was fear, a need to witness the end of a man they believed had dug too close to the forbidden. The gallows were raised at dawn, thick ropes swinging against the pale sky, and Elias was marched barefoot through the mud, chains rattling, head lowered. But when the hangman placed the noose around his neck, Elias raised his eyes to the crowd and smiled. He whispered words none could hear, though many later swore they felt them, as if the air itself carried meaning into their bones. At the drop, his body fell, jerked once, then hung still. The villagers exhaled relief until the ravens came. Dozens of them, black shapes circling above the gallows, cawing so loud it drowned the priest's prayer. When the body was cut down, a shock rippled through the crowd. The rope was frayed, not where it had been tied, but from within the fibers, as if something had chewed its way out. The corpse lay limp, but his face was unchanged, lips still curved in that grin. They buried him at the far edge of the graveyard, unmarked and weighted with stones. But even that night, soil was found unsettled, as though hands had clawed upward from beneath. The town sealed the ground with iron, but in the years that followed, more graves began to shift, more earth split open. It was as if Elias had not died at all, but seeded the soil with something restless. For a time, the village tried to move on, convincing themselves that the gravedigger's curse had ended with his death, but silence never truly returned. The ground around the cemetery grew unstable, graves sinking at unnatural angles, coffins splitting as if the earth itself rejected them. Shepherds reported that their flocks would not graze near the burial fields, panicked by sounds of faint knocking beneath the soil. Children whispered about shapes they saw wandering at dusk. Figures stooped, shrouded in linen, moving stiffly between headstones before vanishing into the mist. The priest attempted to sanctify the grounds again, sprinkling holy water over Elias's grave, but the droplets hissed as if striking hot coals, leaving the stone dark and steaming. A year after his hanging, when the cemetery was expanded, workers digging new plots struck something unexpected. A hollow cavity beneath the earth lined with bones arranged like architecture, femurs stacked as pillars, skulls fitted together like bricks, ribs woven as lattices. The structure formed a vault, an underground chamber shaped by deliberate hands. Within it, at the very center, they claimed to see Elias's shovel, standing upright in the soil as though marking his place. The men who entered the chamber grew sick within days, coughing blood and dreaming of tunnels stretching endlessly beneath the village, tunnels where voices whispered in cadences older than language. No map recorded them, no builder confessed to making them, and yet there they were, a network of bone and dirt, as if Elias had only been one laborer in a work far vaster than anyone could fathom. The discovery of the bone vault was never entered into church records. Instead, the sheriff sealed the reports, the priest burned his notes, and the workers were sworn to silence under threat of imprisonment. But silence could not erase memory, and memory has a way of festering. Whispers spread that Elias had not been a lone madman, but part of something larger, a hidden brotherhood of grave harvesters stretching back centuries, men who carved knowledge from marrow and wrote scripture into skulls. Some claimed that the vault beneath the cemetery was only one root of a far-reaching network, a labyrinth of bone tunnels that connected forgotten burial sites across the countryside like veins in a corpse. The villagers began to fear their dead no longer belonged to them, that once lowered into the soil, bodies were claimed by another order, one that did not rest, one that saw the cemetery not as hallowed ground, but as a farm. The sheriff, who had arrested Elias, fell ill shortly after sealing the chamber. On his deathbed, fevered and rambling, he confessed to seeing Elias standing at the foot of his bed, holding a sack that dripped dark fluid onto the floorboards. "He is still digging," the sheriff gasped before he died, "and he digs for us all." That line became a curse in the village, repeated only in hushed tones, a warning that death itself was no release. After the sheriff's death, fear tightened its grip on the village, but fear alone does not stop hunger. The church ordered the bone vault sealed with iron and mortar, yet within months, cracks appeared in the stone, as if something inside pushed outward. Strange earthworks rose around the cemetery, mounds that shifted shape overnight, depressions that looked like open mouths gasping in the dirt. Farmers complained their wells turned foul, the water dark and metallic, as though fed from veins deeper than rock. At night, people began to hear the sound of shovels striking soil, though no one was in the graveyard. The rhythm of digging carried across the fields, slow, deliberate, endless. One group of young men, fueled by ale and bravado, vowed to catch the culprit. They carried torches into the graveyard at midnight, swearing they would return with proof. Only two stumbled back before dawn, their hair gone white, their clothes stiff with earth. When questioned, they said little, but one finally muttered that they had seen Elias, or something that wore his face, rising from the soil, not climbing but unfolding, as if the ground itself had birthed him anew. They swore the other boys had been pulled beneath the dirt by unseen hands, their screams swallowed before torches could touch them. The priest declared it blasphemy, yet quietly ordered the churchyard abandoned, forbidding burials within its walls. But the dead must rest somewhere, and so graves spread outward, further and further, until the entire village seemed encircled by its own corpses. With the churchyard abandoned, the villagers hoped distance would starve the curse. But curses do not starve, they spread. New cemeteries were consecrated in fields further from town. But soon after the first burials, families reported the same disturbances. fresh soil unsettled, coffins splitting open, strange growths of fungus shaped like skeletal hands rising overnight. Graves dug one day collapsed the next, as though the earth rejected the offering. Rumors hardened into certainty that Elias had become more than a man, that his execution had bound him into the soil itself, making him the patron saint of rot. Some said he walked only at night, dragging his shovel across the stones, while others swore he never walked at all, but tunneled beneath the ground, listening from below. Crops failed near the burial fields, animals birthed stillborn, and children began to dream the same dream, of lying awake beneath soil, unable to breathe, listening to the steady scrape of a shovel above them. Those who dared to exhume the newly dead found the corpses altered, some missing bones entirely, others rearranged as if tested for new configurations. A mason who uncovered his wife's coffin wept to see her jaw removed, her hands reversed at the wrist, her eyes replaced with stones carved smooth as pearls. When asked what could do such a thing, he whispered a single word, as though it explained everything. Harvest. That word spread like infection, until the whole village spoke of the gravedigger's ghastly harvest as if it were no longer the work of one man, but a season, an inevitable reaping that came for every generation. It was in the second winter after Elias's hanging that the harvest became undeniable. Snow blanketed the village in silence, yet every night the sound of shovels carried on the wind, sometimes faint, sometimes so close that families swore it came from beneath their floors. The mayor ordered men to dig trenches around the town, hoping to cut off whatever tunneled beneath, but when they struck the frozen earth, they found layers of coffins stacked like shelves, none of which had been buried there by human hands. Each coffin bore marks of being pried open from within, as if the dead had not only been disturbed, but conscripted. Panic spread as livestock began disappearing from barns, their bones later discovered buried neatly in rows, polished clean. The priest attempted an exorcism at the old churchyard, reading prayers into the bitter wind, but before he could finish, the earth at his feet collapsed, swallowing him waist-deep into the grave soil. When pulled free, his robes were shredded, and his skin bore marks like fingernails clawing upward. He never preached again. The villagers started to speak openly of leaving, but leaving meant abandoning the bones of their ancestors, and some feared that to leave the bones unguarded was to surrender the living as well. That winter, more than snow pressed upon the roofs. It was the weight of dread, the sense that the town itself had become an open grave, and that Elias's shovel had never stopped. By spring, the cemetery no longer resembled hallowed ground, but a battlefield of the unseen. Graves leaned at crooked angles, stone markers toppled as if pushed from below, and the once sacred chapel rotted from its foundation upward, timbers swelling with damp until they split like bones under pressure. Families began to exhume their own kin in desperation, hoping to carry them elsewhere. But what they pulled from the earth was not what they had buried. Bodies rearranged, spines bent into circles, ribs sewn together with twine, skulls hollowed and filled with soil packed tight as mortar. No thief of gold or jewels had touched these coffins. The theft was of form itself. The villagers spoke in hushed voices of Elias as a reaper, not of crops, but of design, shaping the dead into patterns only he could read. Those who gazed too long at the grotesque arrangements swore the bones aligned like letters, forming an alphabet no priest could recognize. And in the nights that followed, they dreamed of reading it, each dream sharper, more insistent, as if the harvest sought not only bodies but minds. One mother, raving in the square, confessed she had woken to find her daughter sleepwalking toward the graveyard, her small hands miming the grip of a shovel. They chained the child indoors, but the sound of digging still came, now from beneath the house itself. The more they tried to bury the truth, the more the truth clawed its way back up. By midsummer, the village reeked of damp soil and rusted iron, even on clear days when no grave had been touched. Men reported waking with dirt beneath their fingernails, though they swore they had not left their beds, while women whispered of hearing their names called softly from beneath the floorboards. The constable, desperate to restore order, ordered the bone vault beneath the old churchyard reopened, hoping to prove nothing lay within but superstition. When the iron seals were broken, what they found was worse than rumor. The vault had grown. Where once there had been a single chamber, now dozens of passages spiraled outward, lined with freshly harvested bones that could not have been placed there by human hands in so little time. The air itself pulsed with damp heat, and in the flicker of their lanterns, the men swore the bones shifted, turning slowly like the gears of some hidden machine. At the center of the vault, Elias's shovel no longer stood alone. It was joined by dozens of others, each rusted, each placed upright in the soil like grave markers of their own. The men fled, but only 3 emerged. The others were swallowed by darkness, their screams muffled as if buried alive. The survivors begged to have the vault sealed forever, but when the priest raised his hand to bless the ground, his tongue stiffened, his words died in his throat, and blood poured from his mouth, as if the soil itself had silenced him. The survivors of the vault swore they heard voices echoing through the bone corridors, not in words, but in the steady rhythm of digging, a chorus of shovels striking earth in unison. That night, one of them hanged himself from the rafters of his barn, his boots caked in wet soil despite never leaving the room. Another was found wandering the fields at dawn, whispering that Elias had shown him the blueprint beneath the flesh, that men were nothing more than scaffolds waiting to be rebuilt. The third grew feverish and clawed at his own ribs until he died, convinced something inside him was trying to crawl free. By then the villagers no longer asked whether Elias had returned. They debated whether he had ever truly died. Old women muttered that the rope had only fed him back into the ground, as a seed returns to the soil to grow. The mayor begged the bishop for soldiers to cleanse the village, but the bishop's reply was short and cold. "We do not interfere with harvests older than the church." That single line confirmed their worst fear, that what plagued them was not the curse of one man, but the ritual of an order that stretched beyond their town, an order sanctioned in silence by powers they had trusted. And so the villagers locked their doors and slept uneasily, knowing that trust itself had been buried alongside their dead. By autumn, the village had become a place of silence broken only by the sound of earth shifting in the night. Families abandoned their homes in secret, leaving meals uneaten on tables and doors swinging open. But those who fled often did not reach the next town. Travelers found their wagons overturned along the road, belongings scattered, bodies missing. Only once was evidence discovered: a horse-drawn cart abandoned in the woods, its cargo of coffins dug open, each one empty, but for a single stone placed where the heart should have been. Those who remained in the village lived as prisoners in their own homes, nailing their shutters closed, hammering iron over thresholds, scattering salt in doorways. But even then, the ground betrayed them. One family awoke to find their cellar collapsed into a yawning tunnel that stretched far beyond the lamplight, lined with bones that had not belonged to anyone in their household. The tunnels were multiplying, weaving beneath every street, every field, as though the soil itself was hollowing out. And through those tunnels, people claimed to hear voices, low and rhythmic, chanting words that clawed at the mind, even when meaning could not be grasped. The priest, broken and defeated, finally confessed what he had seen written in Elias's blood on the wall of his cell years before. "The living are only the unharvested." That sentence spread through the town like disease, until even the children whispered it as if it were a nursery rhyme. It was during that winter that the harvest reached beyond the cemetery, beyond the village, as though the soil itself was spreading its appetite outward. Shepherds in neighboring towns reported finding their flocks unearthed, sheep dragged from the earth with bones rearranged, jaws broken wide as if screaming even in death. Hunters swore they followed deer tracks deep into the forest, only to find the ground split open, the carcass already stripped, its antlers stacked neatly beside a shovel mark in the dirt. But worse than the animals were the first sightings of figures moving along the ridges, gaunt silhouettes carrying lanterns that glowed faintly green, their strides too stiff, too deliberate, like puppets pulled on strings. Some claimed they saw Elias among them, his shovel glinting like a scythe, while others whispered it was not him at all but his harvest, the dead, walking as his hands. The mayor called once more for aid, and once more the bishop refused, sending only a final letter sealed in wax. The harvest cannot be stopped. It must only be endured. That line broke the town's spirit. Men stopped working the fields. Mothers no longer baptized their children. The church stood empty. The villagers did not pray for salvation anymore. They prayed only that when their time came, their bones would not be taken for use. Yet each night they heard the scrape of metal in soil, the steady rhythm of digging, the harvest closing in one spade at a time. When the lantern figures began appearing inside the village itself, no one could deny that the harvest had breached every boundary. They moved silently through the streets at night, never knocking on doors, never speaking, only carrying their shovels and pausing at houses as if marking them for later. Children woke screaming that the figures stood beside their beds, lanterns glowing at the foot of the frame, though no window or door had been opened. Dogs went mad, tearing their own throats on chains while cats vanished entirely. The villagers tried to arm themselves, but weapons meant for the living seemed useless. A musket ball tore straight through one figure, yet it did not fall. It simply turned its lantern, the flame flickering as if amused, before continuing its slow procession. One man swung an axe at another, only for the blade to splinter as though it had struck stone, leaving him bleeding from his own shattered handle. It was then that they realized these were not men at all, but shells. Bodies reconfigured, emptied of will, filled with nothing but Elias's command. The priest, half-mad, claimed they were not walking toward the houses, but listening, pressing their shovels into the ground to hear what lay beneath each family. "They are measuring us," he whispered. "We are only crops to them." That night a dozen households fled into the forest, but none were seen again, save for the sound of digging that echoed from beneath the trees for weeks afterward. By the following spring, the village was barely more than an ossuary wearing the disguise of a town. Entire streets stood empty, doors hanging open to rooms stripped of furniture, floors split by the rise of roots and bones forcing their way upward. The few who remained barricaded themselves inside, but even within their homes they could not escape the harvest. Soil began to seep through cracks in the floorboards, fine at first, like dust, then thicker, until piles formed in the corners, as though graves were being dug from beneath. One woman, unable to endure the constant scratching sound below her walls, pried up her floor planks and found not rodents but fingers, skeletal hands clawing slowly upward in unison, waiting for her to lift the last barrier. She fled screaming into the night, but the next morning her body was found posed in the square, her bones arranged into a lattice around the iron fountain, as if she had been made into part of some message none could read. That was the moment the villagers understood Elias's harvest was not random, but ritual. Every bone, every corpse, every grave was being reshaped to form a design hidden in plain sight. And yet none dared to piece it together fully, because those who stared too long at the patterns claimed. The bones themselves began to whisper, syllables forming in the dark recesses of the mind, urging them to surrender their own flesh for completion. When outsiders finally came, merchants from a neighboring town, drawn by the silence, they found a village emptied of the living, but swollen with a grotesque order. Streets were lined with effigies made of bone and wood, posed like watchmen, their skulls painted with ash and soil to resemble faces staring outward. The church doors, once nailed shut, stood wide open, and inside the pews were filled not with parishioners, but with bodies propped upright, their mouths stuffed with dirt as if silenced by the earth itself. On the altar lay the great ledger of the parish, its pages smeared not with ink, but with marrow ground to paste, recording names in a script no one could recognize. Those merchants fled, but not before one swore he saw movement. Figures seated in the church that shifted slightly, heads turning in unison as though following his retreat. They reported the horror to the bishop, but he refused to intervene. His words were chilling in their calm. Some villages belong to the harvest. It is not ours to interfere. And with that, the town was abandoned to its fate, struck from maps and sermons alike, allowed to rot into legend. Yet travelers passing the old road whispered that the village was not dead at all, that on certain nights, lanterns still burned in the windows, and the sound of shovels carried across the moor, as steady and patient as the beating of a heart beneath the soil. Years passed, and the village melted into rumor, its name erased from records, its roads left to overgrowth, yet the harvest did not end with silence. Travelers crossing the moors told of hearing bells tolling from beneath the ground, muffled chimes that rang at no church hour. Shepherds claimed their flocks wandered toward the ruins and never returned, while those who followed found only hollow impressions in the soil where bodies should have lain. And then there were the sightings. Strangers walking at dusk, gaunt and pale, their clothes ragged, yet their movements deliberate, each carrying a lantern whose flame glowed not yellow, but green. They never spoke, never begged, never bought or sold. But those who looked too long swore they saw the outlines of bones pressing faintly beneath their skin, as though their flesh were only a thin veil stretched over the harvest's design. In one market town, a boy swore he saw his dead grandmother among them, her eyes cloudy, but her face unmistakable, her jaw unhinged slightly as if to form words that would never come. When the elders heard this, they forbade mention of the village entirely, declaring that to name it was to invite its soil into your own home. But still the stories spread, because stories always do, and with them spread the fear that Elias had never been a man at all, but a seed planted in human form, a servant of something older than bone, older than death itself, a harvest that walks forever. By the middle of the century, scholars of forbidden history began to whisper about the vanished village, piecing together fragments from burned court records, sealed parish notes, and the mutterings of those who had seen too much. They called it not a haunting, but an infection, an infestation of soil and bone that rewrote the land it touched. One antiquarian, obsessed with maps of burial grounds, noticed a disturbing pattern. Cemeteries across the region, though consecrated at different times, formed a spiral when plotted together, a spiral with the lost village at its heart. He published his findings in a small pamphlet, but within weeks he was found dead, seated at his desk, with his ribs cracked outward, each one bent into the shape of letters scrawled across his walls. His work was confiscated, though copies spread in secret, and men began to debate not whether Elias had returned, but whether he had ever truly been human. Some believed he was chosen, a vessel for an ancient order that fed on marrow the way men feed on bread. Others argued he was the order itself, incarnate, a reaper wearing human skin until the rope split it open. Whatever the truth, the spiral widened. More cemeteries fell silent, more towns abandoned their dead, until the living began to fear that every shovel struck into the earth was only another invitation to the harvest. It was in this same era that secret societies began to take interest in the tale, not as a cautionary legend, but as a blueprint. Whispers emerged of men in black cloaks gathering at midnight among ruined graveyards, digging not to bury but to exhume, chanting in cadences that mirrored the rhythm of the shovel itself. They spoke of Elias not as a madman, but as a prophet, the first to show that bones were not waste but scripture, that marrow was memory, and that the dead could be rearranged into patterns more enduring than flesh. Reports surfaced of graves robbed across Europe, corpses missing ribs, skulls, or spines, their parts collected not for profit, but for ritual. In one suppressed police account from Prague, investigators raided a cellar where they found a massive spiral of bones curling outward from a single point, a rusted shovel planted in the dirt as though it were a holy relic. The men arrested spoke calmly of a harvest that never ends, insisting they were merely keeping faith with the one who first showed them the way. Scholars dismissed it as delusion, yet the pattern mirrored exactly the lost village's fate, as though Elias's work had simply migrated, carried on by disciples who called themselves the Order of the Shovel. And from that moment, the harvest was no longer seen as a curse upon a single place, but as a doctrine that could spread wherever men hungered for power older than the church, older than death itself. As the Order of the Shovel spread in whispers across borders, ordinary cemeteries became laboratories of secrecy. Undertakers were bribed to look the other way. Physicians smuggled cadavers from hospitals, and entire wagon loads of bones vanished en route to charnel pits, never recorded in official ledgers. What began as scattered thefts grew into a system, an invisible economy of bone. In London, gravediggers reported finding fresh coffins emptied within hours of burial, not for valuables, but for vertebrae and femurs neatly removed with surgical precision. In Paris, morgues discovered their paupers' rows stripped clean, bodies left flayed of marrow. And in Vienna, a surgeon confessed under duress that he had delivered dozens of skeletons to men who paid in gold stamped not with a monarch's face, but with the imprint of a shovel's blade. Yet despite these revelations, no country's law could properly define the crime. After all, what statute forbids rearranging the dead into patterns of power? Whistleblowers who attempted to expose the order met grim fates. One was found buried upright in a churchyard, soil packed in his throat. Another was discovered sealed inside a wall, his ribs arranged like a second skeleton surrounding him. Always the message was the same. Bones are not yours to claim. They belong to the harvest. And through each rumor, each silenced voice, it became clear that Elias's curse had grown beyond one village. It had become a network, a system, a brotherhood of earth and rot woven into the very foundations of Europe. By the late 19th century, the order had burrowed so deeply into society that its handprints were everywhere, though never openly seen. Professors of anatomy taught from skeletons that bore strange carvings no student could identify, symbols etched into the bone like a second language. Wealthy patrons commissioned crypts where their bodies would not rest but be preserved for use, their wills written not in inheritance but in instruction for how their bones should be arranged. And across the cities, whispers grew of a single manuscript known only as the Gravedigger's Gospel, a book said to be bound in human skin, its ink a mixture of soil and marrow, its pages describing in detail the patterns Elias himself had first scratched into the walls of his cell. Those who claimed to have seen it described diagrams of skeletons disassembled and rebuilt into spirals, lattices, and wheels, each design labeled not as art, but as function, as if bones were gears in some vast machine. Rumor said the gospel was never written in one copy, but carried like seed, transcribed in hidden script onto ribs, femurs, and skulls, distributed among the order like scripture. When police raided the home of a suspected member in Munich, they found not bookshelves but rib cages nailed to the walls, each inscribed with lines of text, each letter inked in blood. And still nothing came of it, because no court dared to name the crime, no church dared to confront it, and no man who studied it too closely ever lived long enough to tell the whole truth. The closer one looks at the history of the order, the clearer it becomes that their harvest was never only about death. It was about power, a power hidden in the architecture of the body itself. Reports emerged of secret gatherings in old catacombs beneath Rome, where initiates knelt before vast mosaics made not of stone but of vertebrae, each bone fitted into patterns resembling gears, cogs, and wheels. Witnesses described how the order believed bones carried memory not of the individual, but of the earth itself, that marrow stored echoes of time before man, and by rearranging those echoes into correct configurations, they could summon knowledge forbidden to the living. One frightened defector told authorities that the order had built devices from skeletons, machines whose frames were rib cages, whose levers were femurs, whose circuits were skulls wired with copper, and that when these machines were turned, the bones hummed, vibrating in resonance with something beneath the soil. Authorities dismissed him as insane until he was found 3 days later with every bone in his body removed and stacked neatly beside him, his flesh unbroken, his skin intact, as though the skeleton had walked away of its own will. It was then that some began to understand. Elias had not been harvesting for food or for ritual, but for construction. He was building, piece by piece, the machinery of an ancient order that had no need for life except as scaffolding for the dead. By the dawn of the 20th century, wars gave the order more raw material than they had ever dreamed of. Entire battlefields became harvest fields, millions of bodies left in trenches and craters, bones sinking into mud that the order knew how to find. Soldiers returning from the front spoke of nights when the ground beneath the dead shifted, when the corpses of their comrades seemed rearranged in the dark, laid out in spirals too deliberate to be the work of scavengers. In France, whole graveyards of war dead were exhumed by unknown parties, coffins found stacked empty in pits, their occupants gone. A nurse at a field hospital in Belgium described men who were not soldiers at all, moving among the injured with shovels strapped to their backs, whispering in a language she could not place, marking certain beds with handfuls of soil scattered across the sheets. Those marked men were gone by morning, and when the war ended, charnel houses across Europe overflowed with bones, yet shipments of remains vanished en route to burial grounds, replaced with falsified records and false graves filled only with stones. Governments spoke of disease and disorganization, but some officers whispered that they had seen the spiral carved into the mud with bayonets, as if the order had followed the war deliberately, harvesting its dead in real time. For the first time, the harvest was not hidden in one village or one vault. It walked openly across a continent, masked by the chaos of human slaughter. After the war, when Europe tried to bury its dead with monuments and silence, the order sank deeper into the shadows, feeding on the grief of nations. Families desperate to recover lost sons were lured by rumors of men who could preserve a body forever, who could return the likeness of the fallen even when flesh was gone. Many paid dearly, sending locks of hair, fragments of uniforms, or even exhumed remains to addresses that vanished the moment the parcels were sent. Some received grotesque returns, mannequins of bone and wax posed in uniforms, faces painted crudely, as if parodying the living. Others received nothing but silence, until whispers began that their loved ones had been taken not for preservation, but for incorporation into something vast and unseen. In 1923, a private detective named Richard Thornton traced one of these disappearances to a manor in the Carpathians. His report, smuggled to his family before his death, described halls lined with glass cases, not of trophies but of skeletons wired together into impossible shapes, arches, wheels, spirals, each one humming faintly as though alive. He swore he saw a child's skull fitted into the chest cavity of a larger frame, eyes replaced with stones that glowed green in the lantern light. Thornton fled, but was captured. His body was later found in Vienna, bones removed and stacked beside him, arranged into the shape of a shovel. The authorities sealed his report, but those few who read it understood the truth. The harvest had become industrial, a machine powered not by myth but by infrastructure, supplied by wars, cemeteries, and grief itself. As the 20th century marched forward, the harvest adapted itself to modernity, slipping easily into the cracks left by progress. In medical schools across Europe and America, shipments of skeletons arrived in bulk, labeled as anatomical models from India or Africa, but among them were bones inscribed with spirals, ribs carved with symbols that no student could translate. Professors dismissed the markings as curiosities, yet those who stared too long into the patterns often fell ill, muttering that the diagrams followed them into their dreams. In hospitals, morgues reported strange thefts, cadavers not stripped of valuables, but rearranged and left behind in grotesque poses, as if someone had tested a theory and discarded the results. By mid-century, intelligence agencies quietly tracked rumors of a bone network, shipments of remains diverted by shadowy hands, disappearing into warehouses that did not appear on any registry. The Cold War only deepened it. Whole villages in Eastern Europe abandoned overnight, their graves emptied with military precision, leaving behind false paperwork blaming famine or migration. When satellites first mapped those regions, analysts noticed patterns etched into the soil, vast spirals stretching for miles, as though the ground itself had been plowed not by farmers, but by a gravedigger of nations. Whistleblowers who tried to expose these secrets vanished, their families later receiving parcels containing single bones engraved with Elias's old words. The living are only the unharvested. And so governments stopped investigating. It was safer to pretend the bones were simply misplaced than to admit the harvest had grown so vast it could move entire peoples like soil. By the 1970s, the harvest had grown so seamless it no longer needed secrecy. It wore the mask of science. Universities cataloged bone collections numbering in the tens of thousands, each skeleton tagged, measured, and locked in cabinets. Yet researchers admitted quietly that many arrived already altered, drilled with holes in perfect spirals, vertebrae fused into impossible chains, skulls sliced and resealed with methods no surgeon could explain. Museums displayed cultural relics that bore the unmistakable marks of rearrangement, but labels framed them as curiosities of lost tribes or ancient rituals, never daring to suggest they were modern work. And in laboratories funded by governments, rumors whispered of experiments with vibration and sound conducted on bones, researchers discovering that certain frequencies made marrow dust hum like a tuning fork, releasing patterns in the air like language too old to name. One technician claimed he saw ribs arranged into a circle begin to move on their own when exposed to low sound, each bone twitching like a muscle. Days later, he was found dead at his desk, his skeleton missing, but his skin left intact, draped empty across the chair like a discarded garment. Official reports called it a chemical accident, but within the underground channels of forbidden history, it was understood for what it was, proof that Elias's harvest was no longer confined to graves or villages. It had entered the institutions of knowledge itself, and the world's brightest minds were unknowingly laboring in his fields. By the final years of the 20th century, the harvest no longer needed Elias's name. It had become a language spoken through institutions, whispered through policy, hidden in plain sight. Military contractors quietly purchased shipments of bone under the guise of ballistic testing, but technicians admitted that the bones were never destroyed. They were cataloged, wired, and stored in vaults no soldier was allowed to enter. In Eastern Europe, mass graves from past wars were exhumed under archaeological initiatives, yet villagers swore the bodies were not reburied but taken away in convoys that traveled only at night. Satellite photos, declassified decades later, showed vast spirals carved into the countryside, so perfect they could only have been deliberate, spirals too large to see from the ground, patterns etched into the land itself like a signature written across nations. And in hospitals, new technology for imaging bones revealed anomalies doctors could not explain. Spines fused into curves that matched the order's symbols, ribs growing in unnatural lattices as though the harvest had begun shaping the living even before death. Whistleblowers inside government labs spoke of bone resonance programs designed to weaponize vibration, but their testimonies ended abruptly, each one silenced, Their remains discovered, disassembled, skeletons missing, flesh left untouched. The pattern was unmistakable. Elias's ghastly harvest had never ended. It had scaled upward, woven itself into wars, into science, into nations themselves, until the entire world stood unknowingly in the fields of the Gravedigger, waiting for the shovel to strike. By the dawn of the new millennium, the harvest had threaded itself into silence so complete that most men walked upon it daily without knowing. Cemeteries were digitized, bodies tracked in databases, yet numbers never matched. Tens of thousands of skeletons logged, tens of thousands missing, always explained away as clerical error. Construction workers in cities reported drilling into the earth only to strike chambers of arranged bones, spirals so precise they seemed like architecture left by some forgotten civilization, yet authorities sealed the sites under claims of unstable ground. Meanwhile, whispers spread in the medical underground of a project called MarrowNet, where scientists tested marrow as a conduit for transmitting memory, claiming that the dead stored more than genes, that they carried impressions of events, whole histories carved into bone dust. Test subjects injected with powdered marrow began speaking in languages no living man had taught them, one scrawling spirals across every wall of his cell until his hands were worn to bone. The report was buried, but the meaning was clear. Elias had been right. The body was not just flesh, it was scripture, a scripture the harvest had always known how to read. And if bones are scripture, then every graveyard is not an ending, but a library, every corpse not rest, but resource. By now, the order no longer hid. They did not need to. Their work was hidden inside hospitals, laboratories, morgues, universities. The world itself had become Elias's field, and every one of us was already planted. The deeper you trace the line, the clearer it becomes. The harvest was never about one man, one village, or even one order. It was about transformation. Every generation, every war, every grave added more bricks to a structure we were never meant to see. Think of it, billions of skeletons buried in the earth, each one carved with memory, each one capable of being rearranged into the machinery of something vast. The order does not need to kill. It only needs to wait, because time does the digging for them. And when the soil is full enough, when the bones align across continents, the spiral is complete. That is why Elias smiled as the rope tightened around his neck, because he knew he was not dying, only planting himself. He knew the harvest was inevitable. And perhaps you feel it already, deep in your marrow, that strange pull when you see a spiral, the unease that curls in your stomach at the sight of bones. That is your body remembering, recognizing the pattern etched into all of us. The priests tried to pray it away, the scholars tried to measure it, the governments tried to weaponize it, but none of them understood. The harvest does not belong to them, it never did. It belongs to the soil, and the soil belongs to Elias. And if you have listened this far, you are no longer just a listener. You are marked. Write these words in the comments now. The living are only the unharvested. Write it twice, not for me, but to prove you have seen the spiral, that you have taken your place inside it, because from here there is no turning back. You see, the harvest is not coming. It is already here. Every graveyard, every ossuary, every morgue and anatomy lab is already part of the machine, waiting only for the last alignment. That is why wars never stop, why plagues return, why governments quietly fund the storage of bones they never bury, because the harvest needs constant supply, and those in power have long since bent to it. They wear suits, not robes, but their allegiance is the same as the cloaked figures who once knelt in catacombs, obedience to Elias's design. Perhaps they no longer even know his name, but they know the pattern. And that is enough. Bones are catalogued, transported, studied, lost on paper, but never truly lost. And as the spiral grows, the ground beneath us is becoming something else, something alive, something vast, an engine of marrow and memory that hums just below the soil. You may laugh, you may doubt, but listen closely the next time you walk through a cemetery alone. Wait until the wind dies and the silence presses against your ears. You will hear it, the steady scrape of a shovel, the slow turning of earth, the whisper of bones shifting in unison. And when you hear it, you will understand. The harvest does not wait for death. It is claiming the living, marrow first, thought by thought, until flesh itself is only scaffolding for the machine beneath. The spiral is closing, and whether you believe or not, you are already inside it. And so we arrive at the truth you were never meant to hear. Elias Rood was not the beginning, and he was never the end. He was only the hand that pulled back the first layer of earth, showing us what had always been buried beneath. The harvest is not a curse. It is a system, older than nations, older than scripture, as old as bone itself. Every step you take rests on a foundation of skulls. Every wall you lean against is dusted with marrow. The order of the shovel understood that long ago, and they have only refined what the soil already whispers. The dead are not gone. They are rearranged. They are waiting. And so are you. Because when you die, and you will, the earth will not consume you, it will collect you. Your femurs will become struts, your skull a node, your ribs a lattice fitted into a design you cannot see from here. That is the harvest. The slow, patient construction of something vaster than any cathedral, deeper than any grave, a body built from all bodies, a memory written in marrow across centuries. Perhaps it is already awakened. Perhaps every spiral in the soil, every hum in the bone, every dream of being buried alive is proof that it is breathing beneath us now. And if you listen closely, you will hear it even tonight, the faint rhythm of digging, somewhere beneath your feet, reminding you of the one sentence that binds us all. The living are only the unharvested. Whisper it when you close this video, because in the end, it will not matter what you believe. The ground remembers, the ground keeps, and the ground always collects what belongs to it.